Today I'm going to prepare the binding for our quilt, Happy in the Mountains. It will finish out as a big quilt at approximately 84 inches square. So I need at least 360 continuous lines of binding to go around the four corners and for folding the corners. And I'm going to show you how I make continuous binding. You could do straight binding, but this is a bed quilt that hopefully will be used for years, and that's one of the first places a quilt will wear is on the binding. And so if you do bias binding, then the fibers are kind of crisscrossed, and that will increase the strength. They won't wear as much as if everything was just lined up. And I'm going to use two different reds. These are dark reds that are in my quilt. And so I cut these pieces. I'm going to have a big square when I'm finished that's approximately 35.5 inches, 36 inches square. So I just tore fabric that's approximately 20 by 38, and I pressed it. Now I'm going to sew right sides together. All right, we've joined our two choices of fabric for our big square. Now we have to square it up. Remember, we tore these pieces at approximately 20 by 38 inches. And we opened the seam. We pressed the seam flat. So I'm lucky that I have a great big 20.5 inch square. And I put blue painter's tape right on the 18-inch mark, and so we're gonna, luckily the ruler is see-through, so I can carefully place that blue tape so it runs in the center of our seam, just like that. And this is close to the top. I'm going to square this off right now. And then this way. So there is one edge of our big square. And now I'm going to rotate this. I'm going to keep working from that square edge. So I've rotated this. Now we know this is a square corner. I'm putting my tape there, and I'm going to put a pin, a straight pin, right here at the 18-inch mark. I'm going to mark it both at the top and the bottom of my tape here. So that's 18 inches right there. So I have a nice long plastic straight edge here. So this was our square corner that we first cut off. And so I'm putting that ruler right on the edge of that. And I'm going to finish this cut. Take that all the way to the edge here. I move my hand with my cutter so the ruler doesn't slide. All right, then from this also cut edge that we know was square, we're measuring over here to the center and put a pin at our 18-inch mark. We've lined the blue tape up with our 18-inch mark, and now we're going to trim this other corner. We probably could have tried to do this with a little wider piece of fabric in the beginning. I think I may have shortchanged us a bit. So now we're going to rotate it again. Now we have our center seam line to put our 18-inch mark on again. We don't need that pin in the middle now. Okay, we've rotated our cutting board and lined it up again with the center seam with our blue painter's tape. gonna trim down this side. All right, so we rotated our big square again, and we have a seam allowance here to line up our 18 inches. And so now we're just gonna finish squaring this up. Okay, now we put pins in either opposite sides to mark the 18-inch centers. And now we need to draw a long diagonal line from one corner to the other. And to make that possible, I just butt up 2 of my rulers together. And I'm going to go ahead and mark this as a chalk line. We'll be cutting this in half diagonally. Now we have our 2 diagonals, and we've been working on the wrong side of the fabric. So we're going to turn that over and put right sides together. And our pins should match pins. So we're just going to line those up. Right sides together, and we're going to pin this together and then stitch along this seam line. We'll put a 1/4 inch seam in here. Right, now we've pinned this top where the 2 sides were together. We brought together the 2 pins. The other straight edge or seam allowance that we joined is over here, and a piece of it's over here. It's going to give us a nice kind of stripy binding. Take this to the sewing machine and stitch. I like to use the walking foot when I do long seams like this so it doesn't stretch. We're going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then we will press this seam allowance open also. This is the seam we just sewed together, joining those 2 triangular shaped pieces with a 1/4 inch seam, and then we pressed it open. And now on the wrong side of the quilt, we're going to mark our cutting lines. That's the next step.
Hi, so we marked our bias binding at 3 inches. And originally we'd marked it in chalk, but the chalk kept disappearing as we were trying to manipulate the fabric. You'll see in a second. So we ended up just using a green Prismacolor colored pencil to mark to mark our lines. So we've marked every 3 inches. Okay. So this seam right here is the one that we just sewed together, the 2 big triangles. This seam and this one were our originals. When we first took the 2 individual pieces of fabric to the sewing machine and sewed them together. So we're going to take our original seams together on opposite ends. So flip your fabric over. You want right sides together. I'm going to join my seams here. You're basically making kind of almost like an infinity scarf. So bring them together. But then what you want to do is you want to offset them by 1. So you're going to take your green line and match it up to not the direct one that would have gone through, but 1 over. And by doing that, you'll get a, rather than just coils, you'll end up with a continuous binding. Okay, so the next step is to pin them together. So you're going to go through your green line about a 1/4 inch on one side. Find your offset green line on the other side. Go through it about a 1/4 inch. Make sure that your edges of your fabric are lined up, and then you can just straight pin. Because what will end up happening is we'll do this all the way down. So we'll do another one. You're going to go through about a 1/4 inch your green line. Find your green line at about a 1/4 inch on the other side. Make sure your edges are matched. and then straight pin. So you're going to do this all the way down with each one of your green lines. And then what will end up happening is we'll take this to the sewing machine, sew 1/4 of an inch, and then the lines will be aligned because we'll be 1/4 of an inch in. Okay, so as you can see, we've pinned it all together, all of our green lines matching, and it creates this kind of unwieldy shaped, almost like an infinity scarf. So from here we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch seam allowance along where we have pinned. Okay.
All right, this is what this weird piece of, it's not a tube, not exactly a tube, it's an offset tube. This is what it looks like. This is the seam that Rachel just created, and we don't have to press that open now. We'll press that open after we have our strips cut, and then we'll be folding them in half to make our continuous binding. But I just wanted to show you how it's offset here and here. This was extra, and I'm just going to come in here to the green line. We've got a nice line now that I can see, and we'll just be cutting strips. And this little bit is a little extra that will come off, so that we'll end up with 3-inch wide bias strips that will be ironed in half, and that is the binding edge after we've pressed it that we'll be sewing to the top of our quilt.